Hey everybody, hope everyone is doing well, whether you're joining us live tonight or through the replay. Tonight we're going to look at the third week in a row of synthesis, and we'll continue in synthesis the next couple weeks through Fiveable. So synthesis every year, students feel generally pretty good about, but I definitely want to work with you through Fiveable to continue to raise your comfort with synthesis and to continue to raise your actual synthesis skills. So 2 weeks ago, we just took our first live session to break down synthesis and figure out what exactly are we supposed to do with this task, what kind of synthesis prompts should we expect this year, etc. Last week, we did a deep dive on effective introductions. Tonight's the most important live session in synthesis, so we'll continue with synthesis next week, but tonight is really anchoring our entire series. Tonight is all about the body paragraphs. So you'll see tonight it's going to be a lot of writing for a body paragraph or in our body paragraphs. It's going to be very important that we do everything that we need to do in synthesis essay in our body paragraphs. So the intros, yeah, they're really nice. When I can write a good intro, it really sets me apart from the field. But good intros mean nothing if I can't back them up with really good synthesis writing in my body paragraphs. We will touch on conclusions in a couple weeks. Next week, I will talk with you through how to cite sources specifically, both as a writer in terms of really effective writing style and also just grammatically, what is the right way to cite sources. A frequently asked question for next week is, should I paraphrase versus cite? We'll get into all of those type of sources, source citation questions, I should say. But tonight, let's go ahead and jump in. If you have a question, please ask me. I want to make sure you leave here tonight, if you're in the live session, really feeling good about putting together a synthesis body paragraph. All right, I call this session Control the Sources. It's very important that you are in control of the sources. You are not letting them control you, your ideas, or your writing. So I said a couple weeks ago when we started synthesis that before you even flip the prompt page, you should know, or you should at least be thinking, what do you think or believe about the topic? The reason that's important is because source A might sound very persuasive and have a lot of good points. Source B might sound just as persuasive, but they might be on polar opposite sides, and you'll be swung to and fro from the sources of what you really believe. So you want to know firmly, what do you believe, and then you're just using the sources to prove your point. That's what our session's about today. So I have read the synthesis essay the last couple of years at the AP reading. And so what that is we score actual student essays from that May. I will tell you tonight the most important components of synthesis, the most important things that students do who are really successful. I'll also tell you things that most students do that are kind of in that marginal success category, maybe like earning a 4 or a 5 on a 1 to 9 scale. That's kind of the cutoff, is like you want a 5 or higher. If you want to shoot for a 4 or a 5, you want to be shooting at least in the 6s, maybe even higher. If you want a 5, definitely want to be shooting in the 7, 8 range. 9s are super rare, so 9s are not the expectation by any means. But I will tell you what I saw as an AP reader and what I see in my classroom every year of what do most students do, but what helps the 7s, 8s, and 9s rise above. But again, the next couple weeks we still will be in synthesis, so hopefully you can come back the next couple Tuesdays, 7 p.m. Eastern time. I'm going to take a couple minutes, especially if you're watching this as review, maybe later in the year, or if you haven't been with Fiveable like week in and week out through the AP Line live sessions. So let's just do a couple minutes here looking at the synthesis essay expectations. I showed you this exact slide last week. Number 1, write your own argument. That's what this is all about. A lot of students ask me about, synthesis basically the DBQ for AP language. So I'm not an expert on DBQ, but I do know that there's a lot of similarities, but there are major differences. The major difference is synthesis is your own argument. You're not being graded on getting the right answer. You're being graded on having a clear, articulate argument and then supporting it with logic. So with that in mind, make clear claims in your thesis and in your topic sentences. Every synthesis essay must cite at least 3 sources. A lot of times students ask me, should I cite more than 3 sources? So sure, absolutely. You can cite more than 3 sources. However, that's not the goal. So 3 or 4 sources is, I think, the sweet spot. You don't want to try to like force them in if you don't really have much to say about them. So the beauty here is you'll have 6 to 8 sources to read. You'll choose the 3 or 4 that you have the most to say about, or that you can most effectively use to support your point. And then make connections between sources. We're going to really focus on that tonight. How can I use 2 different sources to cite to back up my own claim? And then lastly, you can connect background knowledge. I'll talk about that really practically when we get to the body paragraphs, kind of step-by-step breakdown of one possible way to organize your body paragraphs. I will say this though, you can't let your experience take over. So don't get too far going down your own experiences, because then it's going to start to sound like an argumentation essay. I recommend every body paragraph having 2 different sources cited. That's what synthesis is all about. I don't mean source A says blank, and then you talk for a minute, and then source A also says blank. So I don't mean that, because that's still one source, even though it's 2 quotes. So I'm actually meaning 2 different sources. So maybe source A, blah, blah, blah. Source C also says blah, blah, blah. I'll show you very practically again what I mean here as we get into the body paragraphs. Just a reminder on scoring. You don't want to score a 4 or lower. You want 5s or higher. And again, the higher your goals, the higher that score needs to be. Synthesis is generally the highest scoring of the 3, but the average score is still slightly under a 5. The majority of most recent years. So you want to score above average, even if synthesis is easier for you than the other ones. So in order to score higher than a 5, or a 5 or higher, I should say, you have to have at least 3 sources that will automatically ding you down to a 4 or lower. And if you start to summarize or just don't keep your own argument clear and central, you will not score higher than a 5. Now, clearly, I'm not saying you cite 3 sources, it's an automatic 5, but that is a threshold that you definitely want to cross. These 2 components will not let you cross that threshold. All right, so very quickly, I don't want to take too long here tonight, but let's talk about kind of the timing of synthesis. I went over this last week as well, but just for review's sake, College Board recommends 15 minutes of synthesis time, timed reading of the synthesis sources. So if you can get this done effectively and plan out your essay in less than 15 minutes, go ahead and get a head start on your essay. But the warning is, don't rush. Plan on using close to the full 15 minutes. Read the prompt page, read the sources, annotate them. I went over how to annotate effectively 2 weeks ago with you all. And then outline your essay. Figure out what is your idea, what is your claim, and what sources can you use to back up your claim. Once you've done that, you've got, College Board recommends 40 minutes per essay, so 40 minutes for a synthesis essay. Here's how I recommend breaking down this time. Most of you I actually recommend, in fact, every one of my students this year is planning on writing 2 body paragraphs for the synthesis essay. Some write 3 body paragraphs for argumentation and rhetorical analysis. Synthesis, partly because of what I'm going to show you tonight, the paragraphs are a little bit longer. So I think 2 body paragraphs is going to be just fine. Now, again, there are many ways that you can organize your thoughts and be very effective. You can get a 9 by writing 9 paragraphs. I'm sure it's been done. You can also get a 9 by writing 4 paragraphs, and that's what this is all about. So I recommend this method because this has been the trend that I've seen most successful. Less is more when it comes to paragraph count. You still want to organize through paragraphs. You don't want a big chunk of text, because you're indicating to your reader this is where a new topic's beginning or a new claim is beginning. So I recommend having 2 body paragraphs and then 2 sources each in both of those body paragraphs. So 7 minutes for an introduction. We went over that in depth last week, so make sure you go back and check that out if you missed it. 14 minutes for your first body paragraph, and this is just kind of a game plan. It's not going to go perfect. You might be ahead of game or a little behind, but this is my recommended time breakdown. 14 minutes for the second body paragraph, 3 for a quick conclusion. Again, I'll cover synthesis conclusions in a couple weeks. And then I always recommend spending 2 minutes to proofread and revise. I don't think it makes sense to proofread and revise 3 essays in the last 5 minutes of your 2 hours and 15-minute timed essay writing, take 2 minutes, proofread and revise your synthesis essay, and then go ahead and move on to the next one. Put the synthesis essay fully out of your mind, and then fully focus on rhetorical analysis if that's the order that you're writing the essays. So remember, the essays will go in the order of synthesis, rhetorical analysis, and argument. That's what order most students write in. However, you can go in any order. Just keep in mind, if you don't do synthesis first, the 15-minute recommended reading block is not going to be your first 15 minutes. So the timing, you're going to have to be really careful to keep track. Every 40 minutes, you should be moving on to stay on track here. All right, I've been saying this, so I'm not going to say it in any other way than this. There are many ways to effectively organize your essay, but you need to have a game plan. That's the most important piece of advice that I can give you here. You don't have to follow my advice, but follow the spirit of my advice. You don't have to go, I'm going to time myself 7 minutes to write my intro. What you do have to do is make sure you have the key components of the synthesis essay. This is, again, the most common path that I've seen work, not just in my classroom, but when I grade other students' essays as well. A note on organization. Synthesis is all about identifying how sources can work together. That's why I recommend having 2 sources in each body paragraph, 2 different sources. All right, once you're in the zone, before you can do anything, I've said this the last 2 weeks, take your time to read the prompt page. We're going to do that tonight because the rest of the night we're going to be looking at a model body paragraph based on this prompt. It's the same prompt we've been in for the last 2 weeks. So the first component is always going to be background information. It might be in a different order, but the trend has been this is the first thing you'll see. The need to memorialize events or people is complex. In some cases, monuments honor moments of great achievement, while in other cases, monuments pay homage to deep sacrifice. A monument's size, location, and materials are all considerations in planning and creating a memorial to the past. The function of this paragraph is just to give you a little bit of background knowledge and just to get you thinking about the topic. And then I always have my students underline the prompt, so I underlined it here. That way I can quickly go back and make sure I'm using the language and the idea of the prompt. I'm not getting slightly off. It's very common, actually, for students to write a really good essay on slightly the wrong topic. I talked a lot about that through our argument unit in the fall, but the same is really the case for synthesis, because synthesis is really an argument essay. It's just with sources. So be careful not to stray too far, or stray at all, I should say, from what's underlined here. So read the following 7 sources carefully, including the introductory information for each source. Then, in a well-organized essay that synthesizes at least 3 of the sources for support, examine the factors a group or agency should consider in memorializing an event or person and in creating a monument. So that's our topic. We have to figure out what's the most important factors, and we have to examine them. And I call these generic synthesis directions pretty much word for word. I would take the 10 seconds it takes to read this on your actual essay day, but you know what it's going to say already. Make sure your argument is central. If you don't know that going into synthesis, you didn't take AP language as a class, right? And that's the thing. Some people, very few, but some people take AP Lang as a test without actually sitting through the class. This would be new to them. So you're at an advantage there. Of course, most people have taken the class. You know your argument is central. All right, let's keep reading. Use the sources to illustrate and support your reasoning. Avoid merely summarizing the sources. Indicate clearly which sources you are drawing from, whether through direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. You may cite the sources as source A or source B, etc., or by using the descriptions in parentheses, and that's what they're talking about. So I could say source A says, or I could say Savage says. I'm not going to spend much time tonight talking about how to cite or my recommendations for citing. However, that's my entire live session next week. So that's a valuable live session. I actually just was going over the same information in my class because we're in the thick of synthesis right now in my AP class. And my students had a lot of really good questions. So I'm going to actually take some of their frequently asked questions and put them in my PowerPoint next week. Now, with all of that said, Tonight you'll see me cite sources because you're going to see me write a body paragraph. However, I'm not going to really give a lot of capital to explaining why I'm citing it this way or like the ins and outs of citing. So everything that I'll show you will be correct, but it just won't be the primary focus tonight. The primary focus tonight will be the flow of my ideas, how my argument is central, and how I'm effectively using sources to prove my point. All right, I've said this before you flip the page and even start reading the sources. We're not going to read sources tonight, but I am going to think about what I would do before I would read the sources. Brainstorm your ideas. So if I have to choose the most important factors, okay, I can think of 5 before I even start reading the sources. I can think of cost, location. Of course, they gave me those in the background knowledge, so those aren't super impressive that I came up with those, but hey, they're valid. Public perception, environmental impact, economic impact. Those are what I've thought of off the bat. Now I would read the sources, see what sources line up with those, and then use that in just continuing thinking as I'm reading the sources to narrow down my focus. So let's say I have 3 body paragraphs. Again, I think most people write 2, but for the sake of argument, let's say I've done 3. I want to mix environmental impact and economic impact. I just didn't have enough of my own knowledge, plus the sources didn't really line up enough. So I'm going to go to cost, location, and public perception because I can have a full body paragraph on each of those. So let's jump in for the rest of the night on effective synthesis body paragraphs. The function is very, very important. You are arguing your position. Your position has to be clear. Your topic sentence should actually sound like an argumentative topic sentence. It should not sound like source A says, or as shown in source A. It should be whatever your claim is. But you will use the sources. You'll just use them as part of your support. I'll show you exactly how that should look. Show how the sources work together to prove your point. All right, don't do this. Don't cite a source in your topic sentence. I just said that. And this is another key don't merely summarize a source. If a body paragraph is, here's the most common, guys. This problem actually is most frequent. Go back in the photo or the political cartoons or anything like that. Students are just very tempted to just tell the reader what's on the page. The reader has the sources in front of them. Literally, we're trained as AP readers to, if I forget what a student is referring to, first thing I do is put the student essay away and I go back and reread source A. If I'm starting to lose it. So we basically have the sources, I mean, not word for word memorized, but we know the language of each source. So we basically have the spirit of each source memorized. We know what each source is about. And if we see a phrase, if it's not quoted, we're not going to give you credit for it. So cite your sources, but we'll know, oh, that's from one of these sources because I've read it so many times. They make us in college, where I think this is a good thing, read the sources multiple times before we're ever allowed to score our first essay. So we've really spent more time with these sources than anyone on the planet should have to, right? We spend a ton of time reading through and like really internalizing these sources. So we've thought about them a lot already. So don't waste our time saying source B is a monument of Christopher Columbus and he's in the woods. You get my point, right? That's not very effective anyway. So don't really summarize a topic or a source. Especially be careful of the visual sources, graphs, political cartoons, etc. All right, so there's actually 6 steps that I recommend. And this is just one way. Here's what I recommend to my students always. I'm like, here's kind of my skeleton frame or my breakdown. I just say the step-by-step paragraph. If you're not consistently earning a 6 on your synthesis essays, and I know a lot of teachers like me are just starting synthesis, so maybe you haven't written a lot or been scored on a lot yet. But if you're not at a 6, you're not really sure and comfortable in synthesis, use this and then you can outgrow it. So you can start to experiment with your own organization, but this is going to work, but it's not going to automatically get you that 6. What I mean is I'm going to show you the 6 steps that I recommend, but it's all about how you pull off those steps. You want to sound like an eloquent writer, and you want to clearly have each sentence drive to the next to prove whatever your claim is. So with all that said, let's get into it. Step 1 is a topic sentence. I said this just a minute ago. It should sound like your argumentative topic sentence. Don't mention a source yet. Just tell me what you want to prove. In other words, clearly write the point you're about to argue. Now, if you only have 2 body paragraphs, like most of my students will, you want to make sure you really have something worth arguing about here. You really want to make sure your topic sentence is clear. Okay, step 2 then. In 1 to 3 sentences, you're introducing and citing your first source, whatever that is. So it could be source D, it could be source F, it doesn't matter. But you're citing whatever source you want to start with. It doesn't have to go in order, so don't mishear me here. It can go in any order. Source A, B, C, D, E is just a convenient way to number them, right? So you're going to find the source that you want to begin your paragraph with. But, and this is going to be our focus next week, you're not just going to sound like a freshman or sophomore in high school that says, for example, source A says, and then give me 15 words on the page. You'll see in my writing tonight examples of effective embedded quotes. That's important for 2 reasons. And again, this is our focus for the entire live session next week, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But an effective integrating of key phrases in your quotes or embedding your quotes first is important because you are staying in control of the idea. You are not giving up and conceding the floor to source A. That's not very effective. You can't say, I think blank, because let me quote source A for like a sentence or 2. That's not your own logic. You're just plugging and placing. This is not a copy-paste skill. So instead, you're in control of the language, you're in control of the ideas, you're in control of the key phrases that you're citing. Maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words. And second, it actually raises your writing score because an effective use of quotes could be the difference between a 6 and a 7 or a 7 and an 8. Writing eloquently matters. Now, don't misunderstand me. Every year, I talk to students in my classroom and outside of my classroom, and they think, and I try to break down this misconception, by using the biggest words, they're eloquent writers. That is not the case. Sure, some writers use big words, but that's not why they're effective writers, right? They just have an expansive vocabulary, but here's what the best writers do. They have varied sentence structure, and it's intentional. So I'm not gonna, in April, I plan on doing a live session on this, but just in the meantime, think about it. The writing structure, the writing style is practical and very, very targeted. It has a purpose. Now, same with vocabulary. I use the best possible word that fits my idea. So you'll see in my body paragraph, I'm not trying to outsmart anyone. There's not going to be any words you've never seen before. It's not the best writing that you'll ever see by any means, but it's going to get the job done. It's going to get a high synthesis score. So in short, by embedding your quotes effectively, it ensures that you're still the writer, so you're still getting moving and building momentum. And the other important piece here is you're quoting the exact part that proves your point, or that you're going to use to prove your point. And I think that's the nuance that I want you to focus on when we go to step 3. I'm actually going to go to step 3 real quick, and I'll come back to that slide. Step 3, use whatever the citation was you just cited in 2 to 5 sentences. You have a lot of room for flexibility here to prove your point. Not what I said originally. The source proves your point. The source doesn't prove your point. Someone else's words don't prove your point. It's how you use someone else's words that really earns your score here. So I bolded this step. It's the most important part of your body paragraph. This is where you make your money. A lot of students fall short. A lot of students only do step 1 and 2, and then they kind of do another step 2, right? So an example of that would be, here's my topic sentence. Here's what source A says. Source A agrees with me. Here's what source F says. Source F also agrees with me. Now let's move on to my next body paragraph. That is super common in synthesis, but this step is what it's all about. You can explain how this citation backs up your position, but you have to do the work. You have to do the heavy lifting. If you are letting source A do your work, you're not going to get a good score because we'll be able to see right through that, right? Here's another thing. I get a lot of questions on counter argument. So we're going to talk about counter argument for the next 2 minutes. Before I do, let's go finish up this slide about how to cite the sources. This is a quick 1-minute preview for next week. So I'm not going to take too long on it tonight, but we'll really unpack it next week. You may either directly quote or paraphrase a source. Second, cite the source every time you reference it. And again, I'll look at exactly what I like, some of the frequently asked questions that were really good that I actually just did in class last week when it comes to this page. And then when citing, you may either write source A or the parentheses. So we've already known that. I'm going to say for the purpose of tonight, all of this is correct. So I'm not going to focus on nuance tonight. You have flexibility with how you cite sources. I want to make sure we did hit that. But let's focus on counter argument. A lot of students think that they have to have an entire body paragraph on counter argument. And have I seen that work effectively? Absolutely. But I'll be honest. For every one effective body paragraph that's all about counter argument, I've seen 9 that are very cookie cutter and formulaic and kind of don't say much. So my students, a frequently asked question is, should I have a whole paragraph dedicated to a counter argument? And if so, where should I put it? I recommend putting the counter argument when appropriate in as a piece of any body paragraph. So what that might look like, for example, would be some people believe X, or you could even say some people believe X. Source C is a perfect example of this. Source C claims blah, blah, blah. However, here is the flaw, or here is what they are not putting together. Here's the flaw in their logic. You don't have to, let's be very clear, name the logical fallacy. You don't even have to, it doesn't have to be like a cookie cutter logical fallacy. We spent 2 live sessions in January on logical fallacies. They're fun to know, but the point of it is actually not the names of the logical fallacies, that I can pick faulty logic out. The only time that logical fallacies come into play on AP Lang and Comp is through the synthesis essay. There might be a source that you want to rip apart and say, look at all of these, look at the opposition's flaws, right? Now that's not going to be your whole body paragraph. That might be what you do for one of your 2 sources though. So if you're using it for a counter argument, explain exactly what's wrong with it and what the author is missing. Now, again, if there's questions, please let me know, and I'll make sure that anything that's not clear becomes clear. But I hope that that's clear. Well, I want to make one more thing clear too. There's no rule. You absolutely do not need to address the counter argument as a requirement. I think sometimes the highest level papers do, but they do it organically, like I'm recommending here. It's not formulaic. So I know there's a big tension with teaching AP language, because I want to give you a framework and I want to give you the ingredients that it's all on you to put together. But if you start to sound like you're just following a formula and not thinking for yourself, you will not get a great score on this essay. So that's the caution. That's why the way I set up my body paragraph template, or my introduction paragraph template last week, it doesn't sound like a formula. I'm just giving you a little bit of structure to put your really awesome ideas on, but I can't give you the ideas. With that said, I would put it this way. If you see how to use the counter argument, use it. But don't waste capital and waste time looking for how to use the counter argument. You can pull off a great essay just by using this structure. No counter argument necessary. But let me be clear. Sometimes the best examples that I've read do refute some sort of logic or claim in one of the sources. So I guess in a nutshell, use the counter argument if you can, but don't force it. All right, step 4. We're going to kind of rinse and repeat here. So you've seen the whole thing. We're halfway through our steps. I just recommend doing the same thing you did already. Introduce inside a different source. Now, again, I said this earlier in the night. It's not source A and then source A again. It's source A and then source E, source B and then source D, however that works, right? And again, it doesn't have to be in alphabetical order. It could be source D and source B. That's totally fine. What matters is you're logically thinking through like your own organization. So whatever works best for you, put it in that order. Again, it's useful to use multiple sources within a body paragraph. What I mean is A and C, not A and A, because it's impactful to show how sources relate to one another. In other words, two sources back up my claim, or this source backs up my claim, this source disagrees with me, but here's why this source is wrong. That's the counter argument, right? That same thing. This is in bold because this is, again, where you make your money here. Use this citation to argue your position. It's not, I cited a source and I'm done. I'm just now beginning, really earning my score, right? So I have the framework. It's going to take me some time to build into it, but this step 3 and 5, these steps are where I earn my score. All right, and finally, a one-sentence concluding sentence. This should be very much like an argumentative essay. Excuse me. Emphasize your topic sentence in light of your evidence. I will show you very practically what that looks like tonight. All right, we're going to jump right in. So I told you probably about 10 minutes ago that if I had 3 body paragraphs, they would be on cost, location, and public perception. So my body paragraph tonight is going to be about public perception. Let's go ahead and read. This is my claim. This is my topic sentence. Societal perception, both of current and future generations, is a crucial factor to consider when planning a monument. That is very clear and also nuanced because, and don't get caught here, clear is the most important, but you want to be a really critical thinker here. This is really a critical thinking exam more than anything else. So the reason this is nuanced is I'm saying it's both of current and future generations. That gives me a lot of room to play with as I'm explaining my sources and my own ideas. Now, this is step 2, and this is kind of long for step 2. I said step 2 should be like 1 to 3 sentences. This is 3 sentences, and they're pretty long sentences. Let's read it. As I read this, I want you to focus on a couple things. I'm driving somewhere here, so it's not wasted space by any means. It's raising my score. My score does not, I don't really earn my score until step 3, but this is certainly getting me there. And I'm being very clear. So I'm not going to spend time talking about like why I cited or how I cited, but do note, kind of as a preview for next week, how I'm fully in control of the language here. That's our focus next week. All right, let's read step 2. Each year, it seems, people are more likely to view history through a critical lens, and monuments that do not adequately portray history or that celebrate things that are not necessarily worth celebrating are often criticized. Downs, for example, describe Mount Rushmore as being close to graffiti because of its blatant defacing of Native American land, source C. Just 20 years ago, Mount Rushmore was almost universally heralded as the literal faces of American engineering and patriotism. Now, in our modern society, Downs certainly is not alone in asking, did the white men have to carve faces all over the hills that the Sioux still hold sacred? So again, this is me citing source C, but it's at a much higher level than, for example, source C says, did they have to carve faces all over? So I'm in control of the writing. My citation is clear. Now it's all about how can I use this background knowledge of from source C, this citation, to prove my claim. Societal perception is a crucial factor to consider when planning a monument. So this is step 3. Argue. The designers and funders of Mount Rushmore likely did not spend much time in the early 20th century worrying about the reactions of citizens in the early 21st century, but perhaps they should have. If they had better considered societal perception of the location of the monument, it would be surrounded by a lot less controversy today. Okay, so far, this is very clear that it's my argument. I didn't just let Downs, who wrote source C, do the work for me. I'm pushing back on the funders and the designers of Mount Rushmore because I've recognized through source C that there has been cultural backlash, and I would say this is my future generations, because Mount Rushmore's been around a while, and now the backlash is way more than it was for decades, right? Now, notice step 3 wasn't super long here. Step 2 was, so I kind of made up for it by cutting right to the chase for step 3. Again, it's not about, now usually this should be the majority, right? But actually step 2 was longer here. That's okay because I'm driving somewhere, and this was, again, I didn't just like quote for 3 sentences. I just used 3 sentences to build to my eventual point, which I made very clearly here. And then I rinse and repeat. I find a second source that still backs up my claim. Societal perception is an important factor. So let's go ahead and read as I transition to source E, how I'm using source E. Same things to notice. I'm the writer. I'm not giving up time to source E. I'm not giving up more than a handful of words at a time. I'm in control. All right. While there is increasing societal criticism of monuments that celebrate the wrong parts of history, arguably worse is when monuments are constructed in an attempt to rewrite history. So it's kind of my transition word, shifting from Mount Rushmore to the Holocaust Museum, which you'll see here in a second. There was, quote, immediate and intense controversy, for example, when plans were released to construct a Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Critics pointed out the irony of the United States spending federal funding to build a museum when the government did little to stop the Holocaust from occurring. Okay, so I've quoted source E a couple times, but both of those sentences are driving and giving context, but now again, it's all about what I do next. So if this one's kind of a more traditional example, where step 3 was a little bit shorter, step 4 was a little bit shorter, step 5 is a little bit longer, that's generally what I would recommend. But I wanted you to see both sides. So there's no hard and fast rules here. The hard and fast rule is you have to be thinking at a high level, and you have to be writing very articulately. So let's go ahead and read my explanation here. I call it explanation, but it's really how am I using this source to prove my point? So it's my argument. Because the creators of the Holocaust Museum heard this outrage and considered the societal perception that a tone-deaf monument would foster, this museum is a success story. The Holocaust Museum does not ignore history. In fact, it memorializes the details of this terrible period of history with painful accuracy. Because of the creators' awareness of societal perception, this museum is no longer surrounded in controversy. As a result, the museum functions as intended. Millions of visitors have walked through the exhibits, filled with horrific memory of one of the cruelest periods in human history. So I intentionally explained or used this and really was thorough with my explanation here. I first looked at like what could have been, but then looked at, because of the proactive nature of the Holocaust Museum, the success. So here's an example of me bringing my own background knowledge in. This last sentence, when I talk about millions of visitors through the year, some of this is from my own background knowledge. This wasn't all laid out in the text, so that I'm not quoting it, because really I'm taking a Holocaust Museum and I'm putting my own background knowledge on it. If I don't have background knowledge, I'll have to do something different, right? But you've heard me say this before if you've been with me this year through Fiveable. Most students have enough background knowledge. It's all about choosing to deploy that background knowledge, and the skill then is just filtering through all your background knowledge and saying what best applies here. That's definitely true with the argument essay, but it's also true at times for synthesis. So a lot of us knew about this last sentence. A lot of us know what the Holocaust Museum is, right? It told us a little bit about it in one of the sources, source E, but I brought my own self to the table. Here's one more thing I want to note. I built a quick synopsis of what source E said, but here's where I make my money. Here's why this is a very effective body paragraph. I am really thinking about this at a high level. Think about what I did in this paragraph. I talked about the Holocaust Museum. I talked about Mount Rushmore. That is a much more effective synthesis. Remember, synthesis is how two things are working together. Two or more things are working together. It is a much more effective synthesis essay than if I had just chosen one. So I'm going to talk when we wrap up tonight on organization and some frequently asked questions regarding these body paragraphs. But I just want to note, if I had only written about the Holocaust Museum, it would not be as effective. If I had only written about Mount Rushmore, it would not have been effective. It's these two things working together. But think about this as well. I did not do the exact same thing. My step 5 sounds very different than my step 3. I've actually put them in the order that makes the most sense for this paragraph, and I've intentionally partnered source C and source E together to prove my claim about societal perception, but they work together perfectly. Mount Rushmore is an example of what not to do, the way that I'm using it in my body paragraph. And source E is an example of what to do. Because I considered the outrage in the societal perception, it's a success story. So my point here is really strategically partner up your two sources within your body paragraph. You don't want them to be basically the same thing, right? You don't want to say source C is a bad example of what not to do, and source E is also a bad example of what not to do. Sure, you could do that, but this is more effective. So really think about how you can drive your paragraphs forward and how your sources can work together to ultimately prove your point. And then we're wrapping up. Remember, this step is wrap up in light of your evidence. So when agencies look potential criticism in the face, they can plan proactively so their monument successfully serves its purpose for generations to come. This is especially effective launching off of source E and the explanation thereafter. This would be out of place if, in fact, it wouldn't work at all if I had done this paragraph just on Mount Rushmore, or if I had done Mount Rushmore and then another example of what not to do. So your wrap-up sentence only works best. It doesn't just summarize your topic sentence. It continues to drive your essay forward. All right, so let's just do a quick rehash before I talk about overall organization FAQ. This is an effective synthesis body paragraph because first, its claim is clear. Second, the majority of the essay is in argument mode, not cite mode. 3, it synthesizes 2 sources together, not just one. And then lastly, the writer is always in control. He's not giving up space to a source. He's not just quote dumping. All right, this is what it looks like together. This is a super long paragraph. This is actually just the first half. I've highlighted in red just for a visual the citations. Now clearly not just the quotes, but the sentences in which I'm just using the sources or just like paraphrasing the sources to go somewhere. And then blue is fully my idea. So if I stop at the red, I'm not getting a high score. It's because of this blue. So if I have to cut something because of time, I'm cutting down the red a little bit. Same here. You remember that this was a lot quicker, and then I had a lot more time for the blue here. In general, the more blue, the more explanation or argument you have, the better. But the caveat there is not if it's repetitive. All right, and then you've got the wrap-up sentence there. So yes, this is a very long paragraph. The first thing that my students do when they see this like typed up is gasp. How are we supposed to do that? So I remind them, hey, you only got to do this twice in 40 minutes. I mean, let's think back to my initial plan. I have 7 minutes to write an intro. I have 3 minutes to write a conclusion. I have 2 minutes to proofread and revise. That gives me a lot of time left to write 2 of these. And yeah, that's still hard, to be honest. But I know it's going to be hard. I know it's going to be effective. Again, if I have to cut something, I'm cutting this down to 1 sentence, the red here. But I want to have as much purposeful blue as I can. Now, a lot of students ask me, and this is actually a very good question, isn't that too long of a paragraph? Like, I know it's all quality, but like, isn't there a better way to organize? So the reason why I actually think for synthesis, they should be the longest body paragraphs is you want to have 2 sources that prove the claim. And if the money's made in the blue, then they're going to be long because you have to do the blue twice, right? For argumentation, or your argumentative essay, they're going to be shorter body paragraphs, and that therefore a lot of students can open up and have 3 body paragraphs. Here, I think synthesis is more important than topic synthesis. In other words, two sources working together under one claim is more effective for synthesis than three claims with one source each. That's kind of more formulaic, and it's not as high-level synthesis. I hope you see that the way I use these two sources is much more effective than if I had a body paragraph on Mount Rushmore and then another body paragraph on the Holocaust Museum. So yeah, they're going to be long, and I actually recommend that synthesis essays are pretty long in terms of the body paragraphs. Now another question is, doesn't the reader want me to organize a little bit more clearly than this big old chunk of text? Great question. Actually, we don't want to see a big chunk of text. Here's a caveat though. There are no AP rules for organization. I have seen a big chunk of text many times without paragraphs get decent scores because it's all about the quality of your argument. But don't misunderstand me. I highly recommend using paragraphs because it signals to your reader you're using the conventions of writing and you've put some organizational thought into your essay. With that said, you will never be penalized for having a body paragraph that's too long. You will be penalized for having a body paragraph that's not long enough because it will be considered not fully developed. So a lot of times when students try to get 3 or even 4 body paragraphs, they think they're doing themselves a favor. They're not unless each is fully developed. I'd rather have you overdevelop a paragraph like this one that you might want to say is overdeveloped than underdevelop any. So 2 overdeveloped paragraphs or fully developed paragraphs are much better than 2 decently developed paragraphs and 1 that's not developed. So I guess my last word on that, if you don't have time to, and this is for any essay, if you don't have time to fully develop a body paragraph, don't start it. Just use that time that you would have used to start it to overdevelop your body paragraphs that you already have or the one that you're currently working on. So final reminders tonight. It's a synthesis. It's all about your argument, so keep your argument central. And lastly, you earn your score not because of which sources you use, but how you use them. You can use 3 sources, you can use 8 sources. It's all about how you use them. I recommend about that 3-4 sources as the sweet spot. But again, it's all about how you use them. The blue is how I used my source. All right, just going to wrap up tonight with you all. If you have any questions in the meantime between this week and next Tuesday, please go ahead and ask them, shoot them my way, or you can post them on the comments tonight, even after the live session is over. Next week is all about frequently asked questions of embedding quotes. So if you have any questions, please post them actually on next week's live session. I can even look at those questions before our session starts and make sure they're part of my slides. I definitely want this to be a very useful month for you. We are getting close to May. We're only a couple months away here. I guess less than 3 months until our exam date. So it's going to be coming up pretty quickly here. All right, everybody. Thank you for being with Fiveable tonight, and I hope I can see you all next Tuesday.